Welcome to the Equity Plus podcast. I'm your host, Erin Story, Director of Communications at CareShare Health Alliance. We're excited to have you here today for our second episode, where we're going back in time a little bit to our North Carolina BIPOC Leader series that was published last year on our CareShare blog. One of the leaders we highlighted, Dr. Baldwin Gibson, has kindly allowed us to use an edited version of the interview we recorded with her to develop an article. In the interview, she discusses how her own life experiences have shaped the incredible work she does today with Peletah Ministries, the ministry she founded with her husband Anthony, which has included mental health support, disaster relief, and a trauma-informed K-12 school. So without further ado, let's hear from Dr. Gibson.
I was actually born in Wilmington, North Carolina. I lived there with my family until my father passed. He was 29. He passed of pancreatic cancer. And so after he passed, my mom and I moved to Atlanta, where my mom worked at Morehouse while she was working on her master's degree for a couple of years. And then we moved back to Eastern North Carolina to live in New Bern, where I was raised, because my mom's family lives in the area. So New Bern is as much home as home can be for me.
Yeah, your dad died really young. How old were you when that happened?
So I was 4, and probably so much of the work that I do around health equity comes from that very early knowledge of how important healthcare is. My dad had worked at DuPont for many years, got sick. They said it was the flu. I don't know that they really even took it really seriously. He wasn't able to go to work. He got fired. He lost his health insurance. And then he was diagnosed in January of 75 with pancreatic cancer, and he died in May. It happened very quickly. There have been probably several opportunities in my mind where if pancreatic is just tough, but yeah, it just he just never really got the care he could have received. And so I think the work that we do around health equity and in the importance of open enrollment and the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid expansion, those things really matter, because I've seen up close and personal. I mean, he was in the hospital for weeks, and I was 3-4 years old at the time. My mom would would go in, and I would sit with the nurses at the nurses station. All of those were memories that still remain with me. And so I think that those are those early memories that stay with you of how important healthcare is, how important early detection is, all of those things. I mean, they're extremely important. My mom had ovarian cancer. She was diagnosed in the 90s. Well, I mean, she had healthcare insurance. She had the ability to get that good care. And so now she's been cancer-free for 20 plus years. You can definitely see what the differences are. And so that's why it's so important.
Let's see. So you said you grew up in New Bern, and so you're still in New Bern now.
So actually, our church, our school, our institute, all of our work for Peletah is housed in Craven County here in New Bern, but we actually live in Pamlico County, which is where my mom's family is from. And so we actually live on the farm that my grandfather purchased after his service in World War I. So my grandfather was born in 1891. Oh. And so my mom is one of those folks that are still walking around who can say that her grandparents were actually enslaved.
Did she meet her grandparents? Did that have like a impact that went down on you maybe?
She was born, I think, about 3 or 4 years after my great-grandmother passed. But the stories that my grandfather and my grandmother shared, I mean, they were so impactful. The house that my mother lives in, my great-grandmother lived in that house. There are these very significant connections that we have to the history of the land and the history of the community in which we live in.
What kind of educational background did you have? Did you feel like your education had an influence on you as far as with the work you're doing now?
Certainly. So I got my BA in Liberal Studies from Shaw University. Shaw is where my mom and dad met. My paternal grandmother graduated from Shaw. My paternal aunt graduated from Shaw. My maternal aunt graduated from Shaw. I was going to be a Shaw University bear. I got my BA in Liberal Studies. My concentration was in sociology, English, and criminal justice.
Okay.
And then I got my MA in English with a concentration in technical and professional communications from East Carolina University. And then I started off working on my doctorate in higher education administration at George Washington University. And halfway through my program, I said, you know what? I think I want to be a Christian counselor. I just switched completely out and decided to get my doctorate, finish my doctorate at Christian Leadership University in Christian counseling. And my focus was really trauma and ACEs as it relates to children of color. And so it was a different path than what I started off with, but that's where I ended up. I'm really glad that I did that. I think every step has led me to where I am now.
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. I know that's like quite a change to go from like one PhD to the other, especially like, is there anything particular that made you change your mind, or is it just like one of those things where you feel like the Lord spoke to you? Or
Yeah, so I had such a great leader at my community college. He had really encouraged me to look at my doctorate and actually fashioned my schedule where I left on Friday afternoons. I was teaching at Lenoir Community College. I would leave from Kinston and drive to Virginia. Now that was at their Hampton Road site. So I would have my classes on Friday nights and all day Saturday, and then I would leave Saturday evenings and drive back home. And I did that for a while. And I was driving to class one night and I was doing really well. At that point, I had a 4.0 average. I loved the classes and the work, loved my instructors, but I really just felt like God was calling me in a different direction. And I was really concerned. I had a student at Lenoir who had been killed, just a senseless act of violence. And I really felt like there were things that I wanted to give my time to, and that administration in that sense might not be where my passion was. And I think that particular situation of violence really began to change my focus.
yeah. So you said your focus was around ACEs and we said childhood trauma. Do you think that like that was something that sparked it?
Yeah, I think I've always been really connected to emotional intelligence and why it's so important for children to have this sense of empathy. So my master's degree, which was interesting, from East Carolina University, was actually technical and professional communications, but I did my thesis work around culturally responsive pedagogy as it related to African American males as a learning discourse community. I was always really interested in this area of education and how children show up, especially children of color, show up in classrooms, and the importance of education and the importance of the community, the importance of these wraparound services. And so that had always been of great interest to me, but I had never really thought of it in the sense of trauma or ACEs. And I know you're going to ask me about my jobs later, but I think the job that probably had the biggest impact on me. So I had worked for the Justice Department as a child victim advocate. But it wasn't until I was a community response coordinator for a grant that Easter Seals UCP got a couple of years ago that I really started digging into this work around trauma. And they sent me to a conference, and Dr. Vincent Finetti was the speaker. I was like, I'm going to this conference because they're sending me to it. But I was in the very back of the room. Like that ballroom was packed and I was on the back wall. But his message that day, it changed my life, and it changed the focus of my work in a way I could never have anticipated.
That's a very interesting answer to that question. You're a minister now, is that correct?
That is. So I come from a family, my grandparents have 4 children. My mother is the only one that was not an ordained pastor, but all the others ordained pastors. But yeah, so my husband and I had gone through, we were in a local church and we were, ordained ministers and then pastors. And then my husband was like, we're starting a church. I said, we're doing what? We're doing what? Okay. And so he said, no, we're starting a church. And our local pastor was like, yeah, got it. Already said that. And so we started a church. And then 6 weeks after Peletah started, which Peletah, is a Hebrew word for great deliverance, like holistic, like you don't just get a healing in one area, it's in every part of your life. So that's really the work that we do here at Peletah. And so 6 weeks after we started, we got hit by Hurricane Irene. And so very quickly, we were doing disaster work and we kept doing that work. And we've continued to do that work. That has been an ongoing process. And then we did a racial reconciliation conference in 2015, I think, with the city of New Bern as our partner. And after that, my husband was preaching and said that we were starting a school. So we started a culturally competent, trauma-informed, grief-sensitive. Now it is a pre-K through 12th grade private school that we have. Some years went by and we started the Peletah Institute for Building Resilient Communities. And very recently, we've started the Peletah Trauma Recovery Resources Center. This is work around the mission that Peletah has, which is transforming lives, strengthening families, and intentionally impacting communities. And so we're really focused on doing that particular work.
I talked a little bit about it, but is there anything in your history that really drives the work you do now, or anything that you really feel has impacted your leadership style?
I would probably say that this work that we do around trauma-informed care, trauma-informed settings. I mean, we wrote trauma-informed worship for our church. And so we're very specific about making sure that as much as possible, we can provide safe spaces, but safety means different things to different people. So at least a brave space. We want to make sure that we're thinking about that. And I think that probably has the biggest impact on my leadership style is how do people show up? How do they show up at work? How do they show up in different settings? Because it's not what is wrong with you. It's what's happened. What's strong with you? Let's refocus from wrong to strong. It's a lot to ask of people, right? Because culturally speaking, because of the impact of slavery, so much of the work for my doctorate I did around post-traumatic slave syndrome. And so when you think about the health impacts, we think about trauma and its impact, the brain that's constantly either in this fight or flight or freeze, you see high blood pressure, you see more, incidents of heart palpitations and heart problems and diabetes. All of these are impacted by these issues of underlying and ongoing trauma and toxic stress. And then you add in these different areas of poverty and the lack of health access. All of them are compounding factors that when people show up in a worship setting, they still bring all that with them. So often we were taught what goes on in the house stays in the house. Children should be seen and not heard. I don't know what that was about, but that's not good. Because what does that say to a child about their value? All of these things. So, you put on a smile, but there is this idea of toxic resiliency. People have to have an opportunity to be free. And so that looks different for our congregation. People say, well, we can't find you on Facebook. Well, we have a Facebook page, but we don't show our services because if people come, their stuff shouldn't be aired if they're at the altar and they're crying. That shouldn't be, we think about HIPAA. But is there not a spiritual HIPAA that we have an obligation to protect people's information unless it's going to hurt them or hurt someone else? So we prayed for people at the altar and still made a referral to Crossroads, our psychiatric in-care facility. I mean, we've done that before. We've said, okay, there's some other things that are going on here, and we need to help you connect you to a clinician. And that's a project that we are working on. We have a grant through North Carolina DHHS through SAMHSA. And part of that is that people go through a program, and then a shell program that my husband and I created that deals with safety, hope, efficacy, and lasting linkages. And then they go through the shell program, and then they're able to see a clinician for free for 3 sessions. So we are serious about changing how our communities have thought about mental health services. We're continuing to do that work because really the impact that COVID has had on our communities, on our mental health, on our ability to process effectively what grief is, what loss is. It is going to be something that is going to be with us for decades. And we are going to have to really look at how this is impacting our health and our well-being.
What's your current job title, and what types of duties do you have?
So I serve at Peletah Ministries as the executive pastor. For the Institute, I serve as the executive director. And for the school, I serve as superintendent. Now, most of my work right now is as superintendent at the school. And so I have the opportunity to work with our scholars. We provide wraparound services for our families, even though our social worker has a lot of that part that they do. And we have case managers that support those families. But really teaching this whole area of social and emotional learning is where I find so much of the work that I'm doing right now. And the Institute is all of our outreach work. So my duties include making sure we are writing grants and getting funding and making sure we're completing those parts of it. And we just have a great staff. We got a great team that really makes the work. I know it sounds like a lot, but they really do shoulder so much of this work and do it so amazingly well.
So how big is your team? Because I was going to ask you, how did you sleep, if ever?
So we have about, including our school staff, we have about 22 staff members. They are great. They come with a lot of their own knowledge and skills and education to this work because it is a lot that they carry, and it's a lot that we're doing. We recognize how important it is, but we also recognize how important it is to get the rest for self-care, and why self-care is not being selfish, but it is being mindful of how important it is to care for yourself. Even at our church. So the first and second Sundays, we are in the building. On the third Sundays, we are online. And fourth Sundays are Sabbath Sundays. And so there's no church. You just spend time being quiet and enjoying your day, with the Lord, with family, with yourself.
Yeah, I remember you saying that too at the NC Comment meeting, thinking that was so unique because, of course you want to go to church for spiritual health, but at the same time, sometimes, Sunday might be your only day off too.
That's right.
All right, so I'll ask you a little bit more about Peletah. So you've got the church, the Institute, and the school. Tell me a little bit about all 3 of them.
So the church, Peletah Ministries, has the Transforming Lives, Strengthening Families, Intentionally Impacting Communities Through the Love of Jesus Christ, is really about how we started off doing this outreach work that really grew into the Peletah Institute. We were going around after Hurricane Irene, and we saw all of this need. And what we now say is that whatever is in the community at the time of the disaster is only amplified by the disaster, because living in coastal North Carolina, these storms continue to come, right? And because we are not making the progress we need to in climate, we continue to see these. Then what is it that we need to be doing to help support our communities to be resilient? That looked like a lot of different things. So we put together our own FEMA approach. So it's food access, education, recovery, because kids are usually always out of school during disasters, and then mental health supports, access to affordable housing, and access to affordable health care. So that's our own kind of FEMA approach to the work that we're always working on and doing. And in the meantime, we ended up connecting with hundreds, like 300 plus churches across Eastern North Carolina. That's now grown above 500 churches that we've connected with, so that when things are happening, we can get resources and information to them. Usually that's done during a disaster. We do have the Eastern North Carolina Disaster Resources page, Facebook, that we started with about 6,000 or 7,000 members now online. And when COVID happened, we just did the same thing. We started up just like it was a disaster, because it really was, with those same churches. And so when the Surgeon General did a shout out about our work at the COVID-19 White House briefing about a year or so ago, we still don't know how that happened, but he talked about Peletah Ministries and how he started the church. And I mean, he knew the history of the church. I don't know how it happened. And so Monday morning, all these emails started coming in. I was just like, what's going on, from people at DHHS up in DC. And I was like, what's going on? And they said, the shout out, the Peletah shout out. And they had the C-SPAN link and everything. And I was just like, you gotta be kidding me. But he talked about how Peletah started after Hurricane Irene and how we had gotten these churches. And then when COVID happened, we used that same model to get information out, especially to our African-American seniors. And then they sent out an email about the schools being trauma informed. I don't know how it happened. No, we didn't talk to anybody before. It just came up and came out, and we were like, wow. But what we realized was that was the way to connect to people and make sure that people were getting information. So whether it was weather or whether it was health, we were able to do that. And so that's really the work we continue to do. And we're doing that through the school, making sure that our scholars are Monday, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays, they have these strict academic days. Then Thursday is health and wellness. So like right now they are doing 4-H projects through cooperative extension. They have music at 2. They have art tomorrow morning. It is really about giving them this opportunity to create, develop, and thrive on these health and wellness days. And so we have a dietitian, we have a social worker, we have a clinician, and they are all doing different projects on Thursdays and Fridays for our scholars. But, you know, it was interesting because after Hurricane, so Florence happened in 2018, we didn't have internet for like 8 to 10 weeks. So we got to the place where we needed to check on people and we needed to connect people. So we just got on the free conference call numbers. When COVID happened and people were like, they needed information, we just went back to those free conference calls. But the thing that we were able to do was that everybody had gotten these phones where they could see Facebook. So we did Facebook Lives with the hospital. We had a vaccine 101 with Betsy Tilson. She came on and did one with us. And it was so funny. The first one we did was with her and some of the staff at DHHS in Raleigh. And we were like, well, you get 100 or 200 people to come on. That's great. We had 12,000 people. They were like, we're going to keep doing these. So we ended up having hundreds of thousands of people. Like we started doing COVID Qs over on Instagram. And so it was so many different things that they just kept learning how to do and how to develop, you know, with different populations. That was just amazing. That's why I say the staff just do such an amazing job, because they were like, hey, what about getting on TikTok? I was like, go for it. I don't know. I mean, like, y'all go for it. But it was all about making sure that people were getting factual information. We were really fortunate and to continue to kind of expand in that way.
Why do you think that you guys were so successful when so many other people struggled?
I think it was something that a mentor of mine who's now transitioned, Cynthia Brown, told me one time. I called her and I said, we need to make all these changes and the people, they need this. She said, she let me get it all out, vent all what I needed to get out. And then she said, but what did the people say? She said, the wisdom is in the room. And now I've kind of expanded what she taught me and said the wisdom is in the community. Even the scripture said that Jesus, he became flesh and dwelt among them. It's something about being in community, not assuming, not hearing part of what I want to hear, but hearing the whole matter. You know, there used to be a radio personality, and he used to say to hear the rest of the matter, the whole matter, the rest of the matter, the rest of the story. And that's what we try to do. So after every storm, we go into community. Yes, we try to help with tangibles like food and resources and things like that. But we'll just go set up in a church. Like we did a pop-up in Jones County after Hurricane Florence. It was literally 48 hours before we went there. And we had almost 300 people show up in that space.
And Jones County is really rural, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
And so it was word of mouth. And I mean, the presiding elder for the district called me. She said, where are you? Where are you? I said, we're almost there. She said, there's a line outside the church. I was like, what? But that's because what we try to do is not assume what people need. Let them tell us what the community needs, and then figure out how do we partner to support the infrastructure being built strong in this community. We don't need little Peletahs everywhere. We need the people who've always been doing the work to be supported in a way where they can get the resources, they can get the funding, they can get the opportunities that they need for the communities where they've been doing this all along. My granddaddy used to always say, he was like, stop trying, because I've always been a fixer. My granddaddy would always say, don't do that. Just teach them how to fish. Right. You don't need to fish for them. You don't know what kind of fish they like. Let them do their own fishing. You just give them the skill that they need. Even though I was a teenager when my grandfather would tell me that, those are the things that have stayed with me, is that I don't need to do it. I just need to set the environment that they can do it for themselves and get what they need for their community so they can do what they've been doing all along.
Just in particular, did you ever have any experience that stood out to you where you feel like your work has really made a difference?
I would probably say my husband and I had a daughter, Hannah Elizabeth, who died in 2016. I was not able to carry her full term. This whole issue around maternal health and this issue around BIPOC communities that struggle with maternal health continues to be a problem, no matter who it is, whether it's me or Serena Williams, it continues to be an issue. I think Hannah's passing and then seeing how many of my friends I knew who were battling this very same issue, who were losing children in the same way, was yet another imprint on my life as it related to the importance of healthcare. But through that, I've been very vocal about this. I had a failed suicide attempt after Hannah died. Crossroads here in New Bern, who is our psychiatric care facility, was a godsend. That is the reason why I am probably one of their biggest advocates, because I understand that when your serotonin level is off, it is off. And that we have to deal with, if somebody has, when my mother was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, people said, you got to get over to the Leo Jenkins Center over in Greenville. Yeah. We actively did it. But when people talk about mental health struggles or talk about that serotonin levels, that something chemically is happening in the brain, we kind of, well, we can't do that. Right. So, there was something I think that came out of it that was beneficial. We also ended up adopting a year or so later a beautiful baby girl who had gone through her own level of trauma, our Caitlin Elizabeth, who is now 18. Oh my goodness. And so what we've learned is through great struggle, through great pain, can come beauty from ashes.
That's so beautiful. And I'm so sorry for the loss of your daughter. Do you feel that, like, in your own experience, that you may have been treated in a way that wasn't like adequate because of your race?
Yeah, so this is actually something that I was just talking about the other day, because I think, one of the questions was about who is your personal hero?
Mhm.
It's my mom, because probably the number one thing she's taught me is advocacy. So I had fibroids, which is also an African American woman battle. It is more Black women that deal with this issue of fibroids, I think, than any other population. And so I was already dealing with fibroids. They're made worse by stress. There were some things going on in my work situation at that time that were just adding to it. So I was like 5 months pregnant, but I measured when I showed up at the hospital that 9 full months pregnant. That's how large I was from those fibroids. And they literally pushed Hannah out. That's literally what happened. At the hospital, the little lady who comes to get you to take you down, she said to my husband, she doesn't need to go home. They shouldn't discharge her. I didn't know I was in full labor. I had Hannah at home that night. The rescue squad got me back to the hospital. Hannah died probably about 45 minutes after her birth. I had a vaginal birth and they sent me home within an hour. No resources, didn't get anything. And I can share it now because the changes have been made. And so we went home that day, that morning, planned her burial. And then a week and a half, 2 weeks later, I had the suicide attempt. When I got back to the hospital, the rescue squad brought me back to the hospital. When I got there, and the other thing is that they didn't, because I came in through the emergency room, I didn't get any pictures, no footprint, no handprint of Hannah, nothing. No, so we have nothing of hers. But when I got back after that suicide attempt, the nurse who was there that morning said, I told y'all she was going to be back. She said, because she wasn't ready to be discharged. So I have some good friends who work in politics, and that advocacy that my mom has always taught me and so I remember the president of the hospital met with me along with the vice president of the hospital, and they said, are you all going to sue us? And I said, no, but I do want you to make some changes. And so if a mother comes through the ER, she's not just sent back home. She goes to labor and delivery. The baby goes to labor and delivery. Even if that baby has passed, they get the footprint, they get the handprint. There's something for that mom. And I know many moms that unfortunately, horribly have had to go through this situation. They get a packet of information on mental health resources. So there were changes. Hannah's death was not in vain. That is the work we continue to do, right? On December the 12th, when we have this collaborative, there's a reason why we have those Medicaid providers there, because North Carolina now has where even if a mother loses a child, they still can get that 12 months of postpartum. That's a change. And those are things that families need to be made aware of. And many families don't know that.
So as far as you as a leader, you said that your mom had always instilled advocacy in you. So is that like, were you always like a leader person? Were you always like the one that was like, being in charge? How did that develop within you?
That was not me at all. That was not me.
Oh,
My
really?
mom really kept pushing me to do something more. Come on, you can do it. I'm like, I don't know. Didn't like speaking out. That was not my personality. But my mom always encouraged me to do my best. I thought when I was growing up, she was just really tough on me. But I recognized that, She was pushing me to, excel, to work hard. That was just an ethic that she had from her parents, that I had received from her and my dad. And then just being tenacious, like never giving up, that tenacity. I think that the tenacity, the hard work, and the advocacy are those things that, my mom really pressed in on me. My grandmother, my mother's mother, really had this gift of community. She loved serving. She had a food drive all the time. She was always making sure kids had food. I think so much of that work that we do is really steeped in what I saw my grandmother do. So I think my family, so many of those ways have been my biggest heroes, because my mom, my grandma, and my granddad, I would say, are my biggest.
What do you feel like your leadership style is? Like, do you have any particular principles that you use when, you're leading your staff or, like congregation otherwise?
Yeah, I would say the trauma-informed work is the lead of the work that we do. It's always from that space of looking at the strength and then dealing with what has happened and managing from that space and leading from that space.
Do you feel that your status as a Black woman has affected your leadership in any way?
I don't know. I think it makes me empathetic to people's challenges wherever they're from, whatever their background is. I think it's always important for having empathy is number one.
Do you have any advice you'd like to share with either other like BIPOC leaders or anyone else?
Take time for you. Self-care is not selfish. You cannot pour from an empty cup. I say it all the time. You just have to do it. Yeah.
Are there any particular challenges that you faced you want to talk about, or like any of your biggest successes?
Yeah, I think, just being able to come through the life challenges that, I've seen and endured, and just seeing how do we make the world better from the place of where we are.
What's some advice that you've had that has stuck with you?
I would probably say the wisdom that my grandma and my granddad, probably my grandmother, because I spent most of my time with her. But she was always looking at how to serve others and not to be served. She lived that principle. And my grandfather was probably one of the most well-read people I ever knew. His name was Frederick Douglass Fisher. He had the right name. He believed in education, and he was just always about learning at any age, at any stage of your life, that you should always be learning. And so I tried to live that out as I walk through my life, is, to never assume that I know it all. There's so much I'm learning. I'm digging more into trauma work right now. I'm taking a certification through AHEC and Florida State University on trauma, and I'm learning I've ordered 15 books last night or day before yesterday that are coming this week. Why? Because I need to know more. I'm learning so much, and I want to continue to instill that in those around me.
Thank you for listening to our latest episode of the Equity Plus podcast. And special thanks again to Dr. Gibson for letting us share her interview. If you're interested in reading our article featuring Dr. Gibson, you can find it on our website blog at caresharehealth.org. And of course, if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to hear more. To learn more about CareShare Health Alliance, visit us at caresharehealth.org, and don't forget to check out our hub for community-based organizations working to promote health equity and community voice, the Equity Plus Network, at equitypn.org. That is EQUITYPN.org. We can't wait to connect with you there.